The summer sun beat down on the Johnson family home, a handsome two-story brick house on Maple Street. Marcus Johnson wiped sweat from his brow as he cleaned the large grill on their back patio. His wife Tanya came through the sliding glass door with a tray of seasoned meat. "You think we have enough food?" Tanya asked, looking over the impressive spread already laid out on the folding tables they had set up that morning. Marcus laughed. "You always ask that, and we always have leftovers for days." The Johnsons had moved to this suburban neighborhood 3 years ago. They were one of only 4 black families on their street in a mostly white area. Marcus worked as an accountant at a respected firm downtown, while Tanya ran a successful online clothing boutique from home. Their annual summer barbecue had become both a tradition and a statement. They belonged here as much as anyone else. Their teenage children, Zoe and Jamal, were helping set up the backyard. 16-year-old Zoe arranged chairs in neat clusters while 14-year-old Jamal hummed string lights around the fence perimeter. "Dad, when are Uncle Ray and Aunt Keisha getting here?" Jamal called out, stretching to reach a high point on the fence. "Around 3, I think. They're bringing your cousins too," Marcus replied, checking his watch. It was just past noon. Tanya returned to the kitchen where she was putting final touches on her famous potato salad. The counters were covered with dishes, cornbread, macaroni and cheese, collard greens, and 3 different kinds of pies for dessert. The Johnsons took pride in their food. It was more than just eating. It was sharing culture and bringing people together. Their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, a kind elderly white woman who had welcomed them when they first moved in, peeked over the fence. "Everything smells wonderful already, Tanya," she called out. "Do you need any help setting up?" "We're almost done, but thank you, Mrs. Wilson," Tanya replied warmly. "We'll see you at 3. Mrs. Wilson nodded happily before disappearing back into her yard. Not all neighbors had been as welcoming as Mrs. Wilson, particularly Roger Whitman, who lived 3 houses down. He rarely spoke to the Johnsons except to complain about something, their lawn maintenance, where their trash cans were placed, or how Jamal's basketball sometimes bounced into his yard. "Mom, I finished putting out all the chairs," Zoe said, coming into the kitchen. She grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator. "I invited Brianna from school. Is that okay?" "Of course." Tanya nodded. "The more the merrier." As the afternoon approached, cars began arriving. First came Marcus's brother Ray and his family, then Tanya's sister Keisha with her husband and 3 children. The cousins immediately ran to the backyard, laughing and catching up. More family members arrived, uncles, aunts, and friends who were like family. The Johnsons had invited several neighbors too, wanting to strengthen community bonds. Mrs. Wilson arrived with her homemade apple pie. The new family that had moved in across the street came with their young children, looking slightly nervous but warming up as Marcus welcomed them. By 3:30, the backyard was filled with 30 people. Music played from speakers, not too loud, as Marcus was always careful about the volume. The grill sizzled as he placed the first batch of his special recipe ribs on the flames. Children ran around playing tag while adults settled into conversations with drinks in hand. No one noticed Roger Whitman watching from his upstairs window, his face twisted with anger as he picked up his phone. The Johnson family backyard transformed into a lively celebration as more guests arrived, the air filled with delicious smells, laughter, and the smooth sounds of old-school R&B playing through outdoor speakers. Marcus stood proudly at his grill, flipping ribs and chicken while wearing his grill master apron, a Father's Day gift from Zoe and Jamal. "These ribs might be your best yet," said Ray, Marcus's brother, as he bit into a sample piece. "What did you do different with the sauce?" Marcus winked. "Secret ingredient. Mom's old recipe with my special twist." Nearby, Tanya moved from group to group, making sure everyone had food and drinks. She stopped to chat with the Rodriguez family who had moved in across the street just 2 months ago. Mrs. Rodriguez was holding her youngest child while trying to balance a plate of food. "Here, let me help you," Tanya offered, taking the plate. "We're so glad you could come. How are you settling into the neighborhood?" "It's been good," Mrs. Rodriguez replied with a slight accent. "Your family has been very welcoming. My husband was nervous about moving here, but gatherings like this make us feel at home." On the other side of the yard, teenagers formed their own circle. Zoe sat with her cousins and her school friend Brianna, who seemed slightly uncomfortable at first as one of the few white people at the party. So then Mr. Peterson says, "Who can explain this formula?" And the entire class goes silent. Zoe was saying, making everyone laugh with her story about their math teacher. Jamal and his cousins had organized an impromptu basketball game in the driveway. Their shouts and the bounce of the ball added to the festive atmosphere. Some of the younger children played tag, running between adults who good-naturedly stepped aside to let them pass. Mrs. Wilson sat in a comfortable chair under the shade of the large oak tree, talking with Tanya's grandmother who had traveled from Georgia for the occasion. Despite their age difference and backgrounds, the two elderly women had found common ground discussing gardening tips and sharing stories about raising children. "In my day," Grandma Jones was saying, "we didn't have all these fancy toys. We made our own entertainment." Mrs. Wilson nodded. "I remember making dolls out of corn husks when I was a girl on my family's farm." Meanwhile, Marcus's friend Derek, who worked with him at the accounting firm, was helping to serve drinks. "Man, you all know how to throw a party," he said to Marcus. "My wife wants to know when we're having the next game night." The food table was constantly being replenished as dishes disappeared. Tanya's macaroni and cheese, with its perfect crust of golden cheese on top, was nearly gone within the first hour. Children came back for seconds of the sweet cornbread, and the adults praised the collard greens cooked with smoked turkey instead of pork. As the afternoon progressed, more neighbors stopped by. The elderly couple from down the street brought a homemade blueberry cobbler. The mail carrier, who had become friendly with the Johnsons over the years, accepted their invitation to grab a plate after finishing his route. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming. Even people who didn't know each other well soon found themselves in comfortable conversation. This was exactly what the Johnsons had hoped for, a true community gathering that bridged differences and built connections. Jamal turned up the music slightly as people started dancing on the patio. Marcus watched his wife laugh as her sister pulled her into a dance. He smiled, feeling content at how perfectly the day was unfolding. No one noticed when Roger Whitman's front door slammed shut as he stormed across his lawn, his face red with anger, heading straight toward the Johnson property with determined steps. Roger Whitman marched toward the Johnsons' backyard fence with a scowl that deepened the lines on his sunburned face. His gray hair was uncombed, and his polo shirt had a coffee stain near the collar. At 62, Roger had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years and considered himself its unofficial guardian. Hey, you people!" Roger shouted over the fence, his voice cutting through the music. Several conversations stopped abruptly. "Turn that jungle music down right now." Marcus noticed the commotion and handed the grilling tongs to his brother Ray. He walked calmly to the fence where Roger stood with his arms crossed. "Afternoon, Mr. Whitman," Marcus said, keeping his voice level. "Is there a problem?" "You bet there's a problem," Roger snapped, pointing at the speakers. "That noise is disturbing the whole neighborhood, and there are too many cars blocking the street. What if there was an emergency? How would an ambulance get through?" Tanya joined her husband at the fence, putting a supportive hand on his back. She noticed their children watching nervously from across the yard. "We made sure to park legally, Mr. Whitman," Tanya explained. "And we keep the music at a reasonable volume. We checked the noise ordinance rules before planning this." Roger's face grew redder. "I don't care what the rules say. I know what's appropriate for this neighborhood, and this isn't it." By now, several guests had noticed the confrontation. The music suddenly seemed too loud in the awkward silence that was spreading across the yard. Jamal walked over to the speaker and turned the volume down slightly. "Look, we're just having a family gathering," Marcus said. "We invited the neighbors. Mrs. Wilson is here, and the Rodriguez family too." Roger snorted. "Well, I wasn't invited." "Actually," Tanya said quietly, "we left an invitation in your mailbox on Tuesday." "I don't need your charity invitations," Roger hissed, lowering his voice so only Marcus and Tanya could hear. "I've lived here since before people like you could even buy houses in this area." Marcus felt his jaw tighten but kept his expression neutral. He was all too familiar with these situations and had taught his children that remaining calm was sometimes the only protection they had. Mrs. Wilson, noticing the tension, made her way over with her cane. "Roger Whitman, what on earth are you doing causing a scene? The Johnsons are having a lovely gathering. Why don't you join us instead of complaining?" "Stay out of this, Eleanor," Roger said without looking at her. "You don't understand what's happening to our neighborhood. First it was them, now the Mexicans across the street. Property values are going to tank. Gasps came from those close enough to hear. Mrs. Rodriguez quickly gathered her children and moved them toward the house, her face flushed with embarrassment. Tanya's sister Keisha stepped forward. "Excuse me, what exactly do you mean by that?" Marcus put up a hand to stop the situation from escalating. "Mr. Whitman, this is a family event. We're not breaking any rules. If you have concerns about parking or noise, we can discuss them like neighbors, not like this." "Like neighbors?" Roger laughed bitterly. "We're not neighbors. You're just occupying space here until the neighborhood goes downhill enough that you feel comfortable." Some of the children had stopped playing and were watching the adults with wide eyes. Zoe quickly organized the younger ones into a game away from the fence, trying to distract them. "I've called the police," Roger announced loudly, holding up his cell phone. "Let's see what they have to say about this disruption." A wave of tension passed through the gathering. Several of the black guests exchanged knowing looks. What had started as a perfect day was now taking a familiar, troubling turn. Marcus took a deep breath. "All right, if that's what you feel is necessary." The news that police had been called spread through the backyard like a sudden chill. Parents instinctively moved closer to their children. Marcus's uncle James, who had been a civil rights activist in his younger days, stood up straight, his festive mood instantly replaced with vigilance. "Everyone stay calm," Marcus announced, trying to keep his voice steady. "We haven't done anything wrong. Let's continue enjoying ourselves." But the damage was done. The carefree atmosphere had vanished. Some guests began gathering their belongings, making quiet excuses about other commitments. Tanya watched with sadness as the Rodriguez family prepared to leave. "Please don't go," she said to Mrs. Rodriguez. "This will be sorted out quickly." Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. "My husband doesn't have his papers yet. We can't risk any trouble." Roger Whitman remained at the fence, watching the discomfort he had caused with barely concealed satisfaction. He raised his voice again. "You see what happens? These people bring their loud music and their crowds, and now everyone's uncomfortable." Marcus's brother Ray, less patient than Marcus, stepped forward. "The only one making people uncomfortable is you, man. Why don't you go back to your house and leave us alone?" "I have every right to stand on this sidewalk," Roger shot back. "This is a public space in my neighborhood." Tanya pulled Marcus aside. "Should we just end the party?" she whispered. "I don't want this to get worse, especially with the kids here." Before Marcus could answer, Roger started taking photos with his phone, pointing it at the guests, the parked cars, and even at the children playing. "What are you doing?" Jamal demanded, stepping between Roger and the younger children. At 14, he was already tall for his age, but his voice cracked with tension. "Stop taking pictures of my cousins." "I'm documenting the disturbance," Roger replied with a smirk. "For the authorities." Marcus hurried over and put his hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Go back to the house, son." "But Dad, ease." "Now, Jamal," Marcus said firmly. Then he turned to Roger. "Mr. Whitman, please stop photographing our children. That's crossing a line." Roger's face twisted with anger. "Don't tell me what to do, boy." The word hung in the air like poison. Marcus stiffened, and several of the male guests moved toward the fence. Tanya quickly positioned herself between them and Roger. "Everyone, please," she pleaded. "Let's not give him what he wants." Derek, Marcus's coworker, had been filming the encounter discreetly on his phone. "Don't worry," he said quietly to Tanya. "I'm getting all of this." Roger noticed the phone and pointed at Derek. "You better not be recording me without permission. That's illegal." "So is harassment," Derek replied calmly, continuing to record. Roger's face grew even redder. He reached over the fence as if to grab Derek's phone. "Give me that right now." Ray stepped between them. "Don't even think about it." Roger backed up a step, then began shouting racial slurs that made everyone flinch. Parents covered children's ears, and Mrs. Wilson gasped in shock. "That's enough." Marcus's voice boomed across the yard with an authority that made even Roger pause. "Mr. Whitman, you need to leave now. The police are coming, as you wanted. We'll let them sort this out." "You think they'll take your side?" Roger sneered. "This neighborhood has standards. People like you are bringing it down with your ghetto parties." Tanya looked at her beautiful home, The carefully prepared food, their respectably dressed guests, professionals, business owners, teachers, and families, and felt a wave of frustration so strong it brought tears to her eyes. In the distance, they heard the sound of sirens approaching. Several guests exchanged worried glances. "It's going to be okay," Marcus told everyone, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "We haven't done anything wrong." 2 police cars pulled up in front of the Johnson home, their lights flashing but sirens now silent. The first car was a standard patrol vehicle with 2 officers. The second was an unmarked black SUV with tinted windows. "Everyone just stay calm," Marcus said, moving toward the front yard to meet the officers. Tanya followed close behind, her heart racing despite her effort to appear composed. Several of the guests, particularly the older men, stood up straighter, their expressions guarded. Uncle James quietly instructed some of the younger men to stay back. "Let Marcus handle this," he said firmly. Roger Whitman stood triumphantly by the fence, arms crossed over his chest. Finally, he muttered loud enough for others to hear. "Now they'll see who really belongs here." The first 2 officers approached, one white male in his 40s and a younger black female officer. They walked with the practiced caution of people trained to view every situation as potentially dangerous. "Good afternoon," the male officer said, his hand resting near his belt. "We received a complaint about a disturbance." Before Marcus could respond, Roger pushed forward. "It's about time. I'm the one who called. These people are having some kind of block party without permits. The noise is ridiculous, and the street is blocked with cars." The female officer took out a notepad. "Sir, could you give me your name, please?" "Roger Whitman. I live at 1472, just down the street. I've been here 30 years, and we've never had problems like this until..." He was interrupted by the sound of the second vehicle's door opening. From the unmarked SUV emerged a woman in her early 40s, wearing a crisp police uniform with chief insignia. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried herself with unmistakable authority. She was Latina, with light brown skin and sharp, observant eyes. "I'll take it from here, Officers Chen and Washington," she said as she approached. "I'm Chief Alexandra Rivera." A murmur spread through the gathering. Everyone in town had heard about the new police chief appointed just 3 months ago, the first woman and first Latina to hold the position. She had made headlines with her promises of community-oriented policing reforms. "Chief Rivera," the male officer acknowledged with evident surprise. "We didn't expect you to respond to a noise complaint." "I was in the area," she replied simply, then turned to face both Marcus and Roger. "I understand there's a situation here. Why don't we all take a moment to discuss it calmly?" Roger stepped forward eagerly. "Chief, I'm glad you're here. These people..." "Sir." Chief Rivera cut him off politely but firmly. "I didn't ask for statements yet. Let's start with introductions." She turned to Marcus. "This is your home, I believe." Marcus nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Marcus Johnson. This is my wife, Tanya." "Could we speak privately for a moment?" Chief Rivera asked, gesturing away from the crowd. As they moved toward the front porch, Tanya noticed several guests looking uncomfortable. Some were already saying quiet goodbyes, clearly not wanting to be present for whatever came next. Others, like Derek and Ray, stayed firmly in place, watching the police officers with wary eyes. Mrs. Wilson approached Officer Washington. "Young lady, I hope you'll take note that I'm a neighbor too, and these people are having a perfectly lovely gathering. That man," she pointed at Roger with her cane, "is the only one causing any disturbance." Inside the house, Zoe and Jamal watched through the living room window. Jamal's hands were clenched into fists. "Do you think they'll make everyone leave?" Zoe whispered. Jamal shook his head. "Dad won't let that happen. We didn't do anything wrong." On the porch, Chief Rivera looked between Marcus and Roger, her expression unreadable. "All right, gentlemen. I'd like to hear both sides of this situation, one at a time. Then we'll see what needs to be done." Chief Alexandra Rivera stood on the Johnsons' front lawn, her posture relaxed yet commanding. She had been police chief for only 3 months, but already her reputation for fairness preceded her. She gestured toward the porch steps. "Mr. Johnson, would you mind if we sit here while we talk?" she asked. Marcus nodded, relieved by her calm demeanor. They sat on the porch steps while Roger Whitman remained standing, shifting impatiently from foot to foot. Now, Chief Rivera began, I'd like to understand exactly what's happening here today. Mr. Johnson, please tell me about your gathering. It's our annual family barbecue, Marcus explained. We've lived here 3 years and do this every summer. We invited neighbors, friends, and family. We checked the noise ordinance rules beforehand and made sure everyone parked legally. Chief Rivera nodded. And Mr. Whitman, what's your specific complaint? Roger stepped closer. The music is too loud, and there are too many people. Look at all those cars. It's a public nuisance. I see, the chief said. Officer Washington, would you please check the noise level with our meter? The female officer nodded and returned to the patrol car. Meanwhile, Officer Chen walked down the street, notepad in hand, presumably checking the parked vehicles. Chief Rivera turned back to Marcus. May I see your backyard setup? Of course, Marcus replied, leading her through the side gate. In the backyard, the party had grown subdued. Children sat quietly with their parents, and the music had been turned down to barely audible levels. Tanya was trying to convince people not to leave. Chief Rivera surveyed the scene. The carefully arranged tables, the high-quality grill, the neatly dressed guests. She noticed the food spread, much of it barely touched since Roger's interruption. That smells amazing, she commented. Your ribs? Yes, Marcus said, surprised. Family recipe. Officer Washington appeared at the gate. Chief, I've checked the noise levels from 3 different points on the property line. All readings are well within legal limits. Thank you. Chief Rivera nodded. And the parking situation? Officer Chen reports all vehicles are legally parked. No fire hydrants blocked, no driveways obstructed. Roger, who had followed them into the backyard, sputtered in disbelief. But what about the number of people? Surely they need some kind of permit for a gathering this large. Chief Rivera turned to him with a measured gaze. Mr. Whitman, the city code requires permits for public events or commercial gatherings. This is clearly a private family function on private property. She walked the perimeter of the yard, noting Mrs. Wilson and other neighbors among the guests. Then she approached the Rodriguez family, who were still preparing to leave. Are you neighbors as well? She asked them in Spanish. Mrs. Rodriguez looked surprised but answered in the same language. Yes, we live across the street. The Johnsons invited us. And have they caused you any problems? The chief asked. No, Mr. Rodriguez said quickly. They have been very welcoming. The only problem today was, his eyes flicked toward Roger. Chief Rivera nodded understanding. She walked back to where Marcus and Roger stood waiting. Mr. Whitman, she said firmly, I've assessed the situation. The Johnsons are not violating any noise ordinances, parking regulations, or gathering permit requirements. Their music is at an acceptable volume, and their guests are behaving peacefully on private property. Roger's face reddened. But they're disturbing the peace, my peace. Sir, being annoyed is not the same as a legal disturbance, Chief Rivera replied. However, I did observe something concerning. Roger looked triumphant. I knew it. Yes, she continued. Several witnesses have reported hearing you use racial slurs and threatening language. One guest has video recording of your behavior. Derek stepped forward, holding up his phone. I have it all right here, Chief. Roger's mouth opened and closed without sound. Chief Rivera motioned Officer Chen over. Officer, please escort Mr. Whitman back to his property, she said, and inform him about our city's harassment ordinances and potential civil rights violations. As Officer Chen led a sputtering Roger away, Chief Rivera turned back to Marcus and Tanya. I apologize for the disruption to your gathering, she said. You have every right to enjoy your family celebration in peace. The Johnson family's backyard remained unusually quiet as everyone watched Officer Chen escort Roger Whitman off their property. Roger glanced back once, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, before disappearing around the corner of the house. Is he being arrested? Jamal asked, having ventured outside now that the situation seemed to be calming down. Chief Rivera shook her head. No, not today, but he has been formally warned about harassment. We have a record of this incident now, which is important if there are future problems. Marcus put his arm around his son's shoulders. Thank you, Chief Rivera. We appreciate your handling of this situation. The chief nodded, then addressed the gathering. Folks, please continue with your celebration. You have every right to be here and enjoy yourselves. People began to relax, though the easy joy from earlier had not fully returned. Officer Washington helped the Rodriguez family bring their things back from their car, quietly assuring them in Spanish that they had nothing to worry about. Tanya approached Chief Rivera. Would you like something to eat before you go? We have plenty of food. The chief seemed surprised by the invitation. I wouldn't want to impose. It's no imposition, Tanya insisted. In fact, we'd be honored if you'd stay for a little while. It might help everyone feel more at ease. Chief Rivera considered this, then nodded. In that case, I'd love a plate. It all smells delicious. Marcus turned the music back up, not too loud, but enough to create a festive atmosphere again. Ray resumed his position at the grill, flipping a fresh batch of ribs. Slowly, conversations resumed, and children ventured back to their games. Chief Rivera accepted a plate piled high with barbecue ribs, macaroni and cheese, and collard greens. She found a seat at a table with Mrs. Wilson and some of the older family members. These ribs are extraordinary, she commented after taking her first bite. Is that a hint of apple cider I taste in the sauce? Marcus, passing by with a tray of drinks, looked impressed. Good palate, Chief. That's my secret ingredient. Uncle James, who had initially been wary of the police presence, engaged Chief Rivera in conversation. You're new to town, aren't you? How are you finding the community so far? The chief set down her fork. It's been challenging but rewarding. There's a lot of work to do in building trust between the department and all communities, especially communities of color. What made you respond to a simple noise complaint in person? Tanya asked, joining the conversation. Chief Rivera looked thoughtful. I try to respond personally to a few random calls each week from all neighborhoods. It helps me understand what's happening on the ground and shows my officers that no call is beneath attention. Derek approached with his phone. Chief, I had the video of Mr. Wickman if you want to see it. I would, she nodded. And if you're willing, please email it to this address. She handed him her card. It may be useful if further action becomes necessary. As the afternoon continued, Chief Rivera mingled with various guests, exchanging contact information and listening to concerns about police interactions in their communities. She was particularly attentive to the teenagers, including Zoe and her friends, who had questions about their rights during traffic stops. Knowledge is protection, the chief told them. Know your rights, but also understand that respect goes both ways. Before leaving, Chief Rivera found Marcus and Tanya by the dessert table. Thank you for your hospitality. I hope the rest of your gathering goes smoothly. Thank you for taking our concerns seriously, Marcus replied. It means a lot. As Chief Rivera walked toward her vehicle, Jamal called after her. Will you come to our barbecue next year? You know, when nobody calls the cops on us. The chief smiled. I'd like that very much. The Johnsons watched as the police vehicles drove away, leaving their street quiet once more. The mood in the backyard had transformed, no longer simply a family gathering, but a community strengthened by standing together through adversity. As evening approached, the Johnson family barbecue slowly wound down. The sky turned a deep orange, and Marcus switched on the string lights Jamal had hung earlier that day. The soft golden glow created a peaceful atmosphere after the tension of the afternoon. Many guests had stayed longer than planned, as if their presence was a quiet statement of solidarity. Tanya's sister Keisha helped clear empty plates while children chased fireflies in the growing darkness. That was something else today, Ray said, standing beside Marcus as they watched the scene. Didn't expect to see the new police chief handle business like that. Marcus nodded, taking a sip from his drink. It's a change. A good one, I think. Across the yard, Mrs. Wilson sat with Grandma Jones, both women deep in conversation about what had happened. In all my years in this neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson was saying, I've never been more embarrassed by someone's behavior. Roger has always been difficult, but today he showed his true colors. Grandma Jones patted her hand. I've seen much worse in my lifetime, honey, but I've also seen things change. Not fast enough, but they do change. Inside the house, Zoe sat at the kitchen counter with her friend Brianna and two cousins. They scrolled through photos they had taken earlier in the day, before Roger's interruption. "Your dad was so calm," Brianna said. "My dad would have lost it if someone talked to our family like that." Zoe shrugged. "He's had practice. It's not the first time." "But the chief was cool," her cousin Darnell added. "The way she shut that man down without even raising her voice." In the living room, Tanya found Jamal sitting alone, looking thoughtful. She sat beside him on the couch. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "Just thinking about stuff." He paused. "Mom, is it always going to be like this? People looking at us like we don't belong?" Tanya took her son's hand. "I hope not. Things are changing, slowly. Chief Rivera today. That wouldn't have happened when I was your age." Outside, the last guests were saying their goodbyes. The Rodriguez family approached Marcus. "Thank you for inviting us," Mr. Rodriguez said, extending his hand. "I am sorry about the trouble." "None of it was your fault," Marcus assured him. "We're glad you stayed." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. "Next month, you must come to our house. My mother is visiting from Mexico, and she makes the best tamales you'll ever taste." After the last guest departed, the Johnson family gathered on their back patio. The night was warm and filled with cricket sounds. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, processing the day's events. "So," Marcus finally said, "quite a barbecue this year." Tanya laughed softly. "That's one way to put it." "Do you think Roger will cause more problems?" Zoe asked. Marcus considered this. "Maybe, but he knows we're not backing down. And he knows the police chief has her eye on him now." "I recorded everything," Jamal said, "just like Derek did, just in case." Tanya squeezed her son's shoulder, proud of his quick thinking, but sad that he had learned such caution so young. "Chief Rivera seemed really nice," Zoe said. "Do you think she meant it about coming next year?" "I hope so," Marcus replied. "Building those relationships matters." They stayed outside a little longer, helping themselves to leftover desserts. The conversation shifted to lighter topics: Zoe's upcoming dance recital, Jamal's basketball tournament, plans for a family vacation. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Marcus and Tanya sat on their front porch swing. The street was quiet, Roger's house dark across the way. "I'm proud of how we handled today," Tanya said, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "Me too," Marcus agreed. "And proud of our community. Did you see how everyone came together?" Tanya nodded. "It wasn't just about us standing our ground. It was everyone saying, 'This is not acceptable.'" Marcus squeezed her hand. "That's how change happens. One backyard barbecue at a time." They swung gently in the night air, their home solid and safe behind them, looking forward to many more gatherings in the years to come.